from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to Not Media. I'm your host, JP. This is episode 12. And for today's episode, I'm going to be focusing on the truth or whatever could be gleaned from all available information about the truth of the Kennedy assassination and from a bunch of different sources. Because for episode 13, I did get a chance to interview WABC radio host Frank Morano, and I know he has an interest of the subject. So I tried to update myself with as much as I could in the amount of time that I had. I was able to read the James Douglas book, JFK and The Unspeakable. I was able to watch the documentary Rush to Judgment. I was able to watch the movie JFK and the follow-up documentary Through the Looking Glass, which was updated information. So, you know, on top of just over the years having watched videos and such, never really delving into the topic too much, but always kind of having a feeling after even some of the superficial information that I viewed over about the topic that there definitely is some truth to the fact that there actually was a conspiracy, and I know that's a loaded word, and through my homework I found out the reason why that word is a loaded word is because it was branded kind of a bad word or a word associated with people who are kooks and, you know, people who aren't wired too tight. And that was a very planned, orchestrated move. It started actually with the board that was investigated to come to a final conclusion of what happened with JFK because the public had so many questions. And that was called the Warren Commission. So, you know, during the review of the information, you know, which the Warren Commission, who I found out had a primary motive of selling to the public that the JFK assassination was done by one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. They're the ones that, you know, pushed this term conspiracy theory. And they kind of disparaged the term to say that, oh, well, you know, this is what the truth is, and it's a lone gunman who killed the president, and if you don't want to hear that truth, then you are just coming up with some wild conspiracy theory because, you know, you just, you know, have a mind to want to make things up or follow things that aren't true. You know, effectively, you're not squared away with your thinking. You know, if you came up with anything other than the narrative of the Warren Commission, then you were some sort of conspiracy theorist. And it turns out it's as the years go on and, you know, however the Warren Commission documented the JFK assassination through posterity, that upon review of their work and subsequential whistleblowers and subsequential documents that have come out, it just looks, you know, it goes from bad to worse, and it just looks like a complete sham job. And judging from the standards of today, 2024, you know, it would be beyond laughable that the public would stand for such a thing. But, you know, it's a different world now than it was back then. You know, there wasn't social media. I mean, there weren't even, you know, there wasn't even the internet or cell phones back then. So really, it was a lot easier in a sense to control the general public because, you know, when people looked for information, they only really looked for it or only could obtain information from certain sources. So, you know, the world of defense and the world of the military and, you know, the military industrial complex and, you know, whatever aspects of the government that deal with defense and that ultimately may have been involved with this situation and the selling to the public of the lone gunman theory, you know, only had a certain amount of channels that they really had to deal with. And once they dealt with those channels, that kind of dealt with the masses. So as long as they could, you know, handle those certain intelligence channels, once it hit those certain media outlets, you know, after it was dealt with and sanitized and then hit the media outlets, the sanitized story went out to the public, and that effectively solves your problem. You know, you effectively deal with about 95, 97, 98, 99% of the public. And, you know, all you got left is a handful of people that are questioning the work. And I guess if you can label those people as, you know, the people that actually are on to the truth about what's going on, if you could label those people effectively to the 99% as conspiracy theorists, then you've effectively solved your problem. You've tricked 99% of the public, and you've convinced that 99% that the remaining 1% is a bunch of conspiracy theorist nuts that you know, don't know what they're talking about, and your problem solved. So so here we are, and I'm going to try to go over as much as I can. You know, the problem was when I interviewed Frank, we started getting into some of the deeper information, and it was just a time restraint. We just couldn't finish the information that we had to go over in the amount of time that was allotted or that we had together. So I'm trying to just do a review of the work I had previously mentioned, those 4 sources of information. And it's kind of basically an amalgamation of that information and then me watching that information and kind of, you know, comparing some of the notes back to back and coming up with my own thoughts and kind of passing it through the filter of me and, you know, what my 2 cents is about what actually happened. And more than likely, even after speaking with Frank Morano, who had a chance to interview a potential presidential candidate, RFK, in the 2024 election, he stated that one of the sources that I read here, and I actually took extensive notes on, I listened to the Audible book, and then I read the Kindle book, and then I also listened to the Kindle book with a function I have on my Kindle as I took notes. So I really did take extensive notes, and I compared them with the other, what I already know about history, what I know about intelligence, what I know from the other documentaries, and just, you know, a little bit of common sense of what I know about living life. And I kind of came up with a very similar conclusion, you know, with what I felt was some of the best information I have ever heard or ever found about the JFK assassination, and it was kind of in line with the book by James Douglas, JFK and The Unspeakable. So excellent book if anyone hasn't had a chance to read that yet. And you know, I think from the research that I've done with the limited amount of time that I've had, it turns out that that book kind of falls in line with more than likely what's the truth about what happened in that time period and on that November afternoon when JFK was assassinated. I mean, don't expect, you know, expect certain revelations that were shocking, because I certainly felt shocked about some of the revelations, especially if you don't know the story. But at the same time, don't expect that you're going to have a direct answer. Or was it the mafia, or was it Castro, or was it? I think you'll have a better understanding of more than likely who was behind it. And some of the specifics, I'm not sure if any of us are ever going to have those answers. Because some of the people that were involved might no longer be living, so they might have taken those secrets to the graves with them, so certain things might never be known. But I think generally if we start stepping back and kind of looking at the puzzle pieces that are there, more in order with the puzzle pieces that aren't there, it's like you could piece together more than likely what happened out there and why it happened and who was involved, and it kind of gives you a better understanding. Even with the missing puzzle pieces, you can start, kind of surmise what the letters are because of all the other letters that are already out there. So, getting into it, starting off with JFK and The Unspeakable and some of the summary of that book. So, looking back on Kennedy's life, he was in the Navy, World War II. A Japanese destroyer smashed PT-109, and JFK swam originally 3 miles, pulling one of his fellow seamen, and then he went to go find them to get rescued from the island they were on, and swam another 1.5 miles, got carried out to sea almost in the middle of the night, swimming by himself in some channel out in the ocean. I mean, ton of bravery that this guy had to do something like that. So he really was a hero. And it's not surprising that one of his #1 qualities that he smiled upon for people was bravery. So when he became senator, though, he kind of had as far as what his beliefs are, he had a change of heart and tried to put $350 million in place to restore 2 Army divisions. So there'd be more of an emphasis on maybe some traditional fighting and not a reliance on nuclear weapons, just because they were so devastating. And Eisenhower felt like we didn't need those Army divisions anymore because we had the nuclear superiority. So, if anybody ever wanted to mess with the United States or any of our allies, we could just start lighting off nuclear bombs, and that would solve the problem. And, we wouldn't really need the conventional forces. But just because of all the horrors that nuclear weapons cause. And I did read another extensive book. I think it was like a 1,600-page book. I believe the author's last name was Rhodes, and it was all about the making of the bomb, the scientific breakthroughs, the technology, and I was absolutely fascinated with the book. I didn't really and I didn't really plan on doing a Not Media episode on this because, Not Media focuses on more like unknown topics, and I felt like it's very well known what nuclear energy is and what nuclear bombs are, and it's not very hard to get a couple books and kind of try to piece together for yourself what is involved there. But just a side note, quick summary. It gave me a sober and shocking understanding, and I don't think most people do have this understanding of what exactly the technology that goes into a nuclear weapon and a thermonuclear weapon, and just how absolutely devastating these weapons are. And effectively what I learned was the production of plutonium and the production of uranium and enriched uranium, and these certain, they call them fissile elements that they're able to have a nuclear reaction. It's not all elements are able to have a nuclear reaction, in the sense that they are so unstable where if they're crushed together or squeezed together at a certain speed, at a certain uniformity, they effectively have a chain reaction and turn from a physical material directly into energy, and this chain reaction turns every single atom, or at least most of the atoms in these materials, directly to energy. And the conversion is, I forget what it is. I at the time I think I wrote it down, but it was staggering. It was absolutely staggering if you compared, like, let's just say per gram of energy converted to a chemical explosion or reaction, and then if you flip that over to a nuclear explosion or reaction, it was like exponentially higher, almost to the point, your jaw would drop. And it was like to the, I don't even want to guess, but it was just staggering. I'll just give you an example. The amount of plutonium used, I think it was, I forget which one. There was 2 bombs during World War II, Little Boy and Fat Man. I believe Little Boy was a uranium gun type bomb and Fat Man was an implosion type bomb. I think that was plutonium, but I just remember the plutonium had more conversion directly to energy, and it was actually more, so you needed less plutonium and you got more of an explosion. And it was something like, something the size of a cantaloupe, basically. If you've ever seen a cantaloupe, maybe like a small cantaloupe, like a large grapefruit or a small cantaloupe, like a ball, like that much of plutonium had the amount of explosive power of, they said, about 18 kilotons or something to that effect. And just to give you an idea of how much energy that is, a kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT. So just imagine 1 ton of TNT, like how much that would weigh. Say like if you've ever gone to a supermarket before they close at nighttime, you see those pallets that they have laid out on the floor. That's like a, pallet of material. Let's say, just roughly speaking, that's 1 ton of weight. If you have like a pallet of cans or something like that, stands about as tall as a person, about as wide both ways as a person. Let's say that's a ton of weight right there. Imagine that was TNT. That was 1 ton of weight, and you exploded that amount of TNT. Just imagine the damage that amount. Imagine a stick of dynamite if you've ever dealt with firecrackers. So you can just imagine that, like, a ton of TNT would easily blow up, a average house, and it was, and then probably cause damage to the surrounding houses around it. So that's just 1 ton of TNT. So 1 kiloton of TNT would be 1,000 of those. So 1,000, say pallets full of TNT. So then just times that by, 18, so say 18 kilotons. Just imagine the amount of space of TNT that would have to take. I would almost take up, if you took a super Walmart and stacked pallets on top of each other, like how high you would have to go and how many pallets wide and how many pallets long. Like you'd fill up a whole building, like a whole super Walmart of pallets, and probably then some, if you had to have 18,000 tons of TNT. And then if you took something the size of like a grapefruit, having that explosive power. So that's just give me an idea. It's a completely different type of explosion. It's not a chemical explosion. It uses a completely different type of physics. It's not even in the sense of how we think about explosions. It's a completely different chemical, or it's a nuclear reaction. It's not a chemical reaction. So, and then when they found thermonuclear weapons, they found out it was cheaper to surround these nuclear explosions with something called tritium, which is an isotope. Hydrogen, I think it's H3. It was cheaper to make, and they could put a lot of it around a nuclear explosion. And because they could put so much more of it, even though it doesn't have as much bang as the plutonium, they could put way more of it around a plutonium bomb. So in a sense, they can use the plutonium bomb, and they can use the heat from the plutonium bomb to do a different nuclear reaction. Instead of fission, which is what a nuclear bomb runs on, they would use fusion. So they would use the fission bomb to actually spark a larger fusion reaction, because they could put way more tritium around a nuclear bomb. And in a sense, you would get a much bigger boom. We step into the world of megatons. So 1 million tons of TNT. So if you figure the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki was 18 kilotons, imagine what a 1 megaton bomb is. So just the quick math on that, if you times the Nagasaki bomb by 10, or whatever that 18 kiloton bomb was by 10, you'd get 180. And then, how many times does 180 go into 1,000? So if you times that by 5, that'd be 900. So it's almost like what, 5.5 approximately. So that's what, like 55, 56, so like 55 times, just for a megaton. And then we're already talking about thermonuclear weapons in sense of tens of megatons. I think the Russia lit off 100 megaton thermonuclear weapon. So it's just staggering. If you took a thermonuclear weapon of 100 megatons and put it, let's say, for example, over New York City, like 1.5 miles, 2 miles over New York City, there would be nothing left. And then 100 or 50 miles radius around where it would probably be all destroyed. And then everything 50, 100 miles outside of there would be all wasted and, with nuclear debris. So it just gives you an idea, a real sober idea of how absolutely devastating these weapons are and how scary they are. They literally call them doomsday weapons because they have the capability of, actually changing world climate. And, you light off enough of these horrible weapons at once, it's almost like you would throw the whole world into a whole different, like a nuclear winter, and you'd probably blow all of humanity back, technologically speaking, because it would cause just so much damage to the crop system and the ecosystem of the world, at least a couple hundred years. So it's scary to think about. It really is. So I think Kennedy had a really good understanding of this. I want to stand for it. So just kind of moving forward. Like I said, I took so many notes here on this topic. I'm going to try to skim through some of the notes. I'm going to try to maybe just kind of come up with some key points here. On top of already doing my podcast for over an hour plus earlier today with Frank, and then working on my notes and such. It seems like I'm already kind of losing my voice here, so I'm going to try to see if I can get through this. In worst case scenario, I'll have to circle back around to try to track this whole episode again. Then April 1961, the Bay of Pigs, where 1,500 Cuban exiled troops were trained by the CIA to launch an offensive over Castro's regime. The CIA, Kennedy canceled supporting airstrikes to back these troops up, and it was a complete failure. Over 1,000 troops were taken into custody when they surrendered on April 19th from the rebel offensive. Kennedy felt betrayed by the CIA. Director Allen Dulles. Daniel Shore stated that the CIA never really thought the trained rebel forces would cause an uprising or could complete an uprising. Kennedy was absolutely furious because he felt he was tricked into the Bay of Pigs invasion. He famously stated that he would splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. He soon after threatened to fire Director Dulles, Bissell, Deputy General Capel, and reduce the CIA budget by 20% in 1966. Then there was this whole idea against the communists in the military-industrial complex called Red or Dead, and it was a surrender or suicide. So, there was no alternative but war, it seemed like, from the aspect of the military-industrial complex. There was mounting pressure for Kennedy to do something, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff's military-industrial complex was pushing him for action. The late 1960s, Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev started to correspond with each other. And there was a quote that was taken from this correspondence, and they both thought the world was a Noah's Ark, and both the clean and unclean were determined to keep it afloat. By June of '63, Kennedy proposed an end to the Cold War, so he had seen enough of it. If we go back a little bit into the late 1940s, President Truman, at the time, approved NSC 10/2, which approved U.S. intelligence to carry out a broad covert cover operations, which included sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition, and evacuation measures, subversion to hostile states, including to underground resistance movements, guerrillas, and refugees, and liberation groups. This was kind of a Frankenstein of sorts. This was the birth of the CIA, and what he had approved was effectively that these agents and that this intelligence agency could really do whatever they had to do in order to overthrow some sort of enemy government. It was almost given like a carte blanche to like do whatever they wanted. You know, if they had to do some sort of a terrorist act in another country or support a terrorist act in another country, which effectively would make a certain regime look bad, and then therefore that regime looking bad would be the groundwork for that country to be overthrown by, say, some sort of a military coup. It was basically game on. I mentioned this with Frank because Morano runs a podcast called the Racket Report, and the CIA under Eisenhower in 1960 had hired mobsters John Roselli, Sam Giancana, Santos Trafficante, and offered them $150,000 for Castro's assassination. So that just gives you an idea. It was basically like a no-holds-barred type of situation that was going on with the CIA. Whatever they would have to do, they would do in order to get the job done. If that even meant hiring gangsters from the mafia to assassinate one of our enemies in this country, well, that was getting the job done. So Kennedy rejected this Pax Americana, which was effectively a world of peace and enforced by American military might. Eisenhower warned when he left office to beware of the military-industrial complex before Kennedy came in. Meanwhile, around the same time period, the man who eventually was said to have killed President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, was renouncing his citizenship from the United States. Went to Moscow, renounced his citizenship, and affirmed his allegiance to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. And soon before that, he was actually 57, 58. He was in Atsugi in Japan as a military operator overseeing U-2 overflights. He had a top secret clearance, crypto clearance. So it just seemed like it was funny to a lot of people, you know, looking on the history of him. And that even when he came back, the U.S. Embassy gave him a loan to come back into the country. It just seemed like it was very odd because he was, somebody stated, a man who was his former roommate who became a judge, both Thello from California, was quoted saying he was the only U.S. Marine ever to defect to the Soviet Union during peacetime with no history of being a Marxist or communist. It was just a very odd situation that this guy, intents and purposes, was all about being an American and helping America, all of a sudden decided to defect to the Soviet Union and then was given a loan by the U.S. Embassy to come back without any question. So it just led a lot of people to believe, and that we soon found out afterwards that more than likely Lee Harvey Oswald was what we would call a double agent. And so he was working with an intelligence agency within the United States after his time in the military. And reason why they call them double agents, for anybody that doesn't know, is because he was publicly selling himself to be a traitor to the United States, and therefore asking to be freely accepted into the Soviet Union. And privately, more than likely, he was working for an American intelligence agency. And I think afterwards, there was talk that he was a little salty because he went to the Soviet Union, that the Soviets, or now the Russians, after the fall of the Soviet Union, were on to him right away. And he felt that he was being scrutinized there. And like a lot of the people there weren't buying it, that he was really trying to go there. So I don't know exactly why or how his cover was blown, or exactly what the terms of that were, but that was something that he was placed on some sort of a watch list when he came back, because maybe he was a little bitter about whatever sort of service he was doing for the country. Kennedy, again, sympathized with the Soviet Union, stating that they lost 20 million people in World War II, and that's more than any country that was known to have lost anybody in World War II. That was the largest loss of World War II, so he really sympathized with the amount of suffering that the Soviet Union had incurred during World War II. And in the summer of '62, Oswald was befriended by Texas oil geologist George Morano and CIA intelligence agent. His nickname was the Baron. And a man named Jay Moore from Domestic Service Contacts gave the go-ahead for him to meet Oswald. So it was almost like this guy, the Baron, was Oswald's handler. And turns out that in 1977, which is now 14 years after, or almost just about, because it was March, almost 14 years after Kennedy was assassinated, the Baron was going to speak to a man named Gaten Fonzie from the House Select Committee on Assassinations about his being like a handler for Oswald, and he was found shot to death within 3 hours of giving that revelation. And George Fonzie, who left the letter, was also found killed, and they said it was suicide, both in the same day. So the two guys that were going to draw the link from Oswald to American intelligence agencies were both dead within a very short time period of each other, when they both were going to investigate the sort of links that might have been starting to become a public problem, that it would have been known that Oswald was clearly connected to U.S. intelligence agencies. So, privately, apparently, the Baron and his wife knew that they were pawns in a game of JFK's assassination, and they were not happy with it. So, I guess this was something they expressed amongst friends or amongst family. But I guess that's why, towards the end of his life, he decided that he wanted to start talking out against what maybe his role was, and maybe how he felt like he wasn't content with what he had done even unwittingly for the intelligence agencies. Um, let's see. And we spoke about how Kennedy was worried about nuclear war. He didn't want all the survivors envying the dead. That's what he said. The survivors would envy the dead if there was a World War III. He just didn't want that. He thought that would be a terrible thing for humanity. So he was really trying to work hard to have test ban treaties with Khrushchev and the Soviets. And then there were attacks from Cuban exiles on Soviet, what is these, refrigerator? I believe they were ships, led by CIA JM Wave. I guess that was the project. And it was led by a man named David Morales. And they were trying to force Kennedy's hand by having these attacks on the Soviets. They were trying to stir up some sort of like hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union. So Kennedy would have to pull the military in. And this was going on against or beyond the scope of what Kennedy could control. And it turns out that this guy Morales would later admit to his friend in the 70s that he participated in Kennedy's murder. This guy was a member of the CIA. And again, they were trying to assassinate Castro using a poison diving suit. There was all sorts of ploys and plots to kill Castro at the time. Nothing was off the table, like I said. Oswald, right around the 62, 63, was associated with Guy Bannister in New Orleans, having the same address as him when he was trying to become, or publicly announcing himself to be pro-Castro, almost like flamboyantly. It almost seemed like it was like a ploy, just like almost like a play. Like secretly he was working for the American government, but he was publicly painting himself to be some sort of a Castro Soviet sympathizer. It's saying that FBI agent John Quigley, whose testimony was sealed at the Warren Commission, stated that Oswald was being paid $200 a month up until the time of the assassination for the FBI. So not only might he have been working for the CIA, but it looked like he was also some sort of a either contractor or informant, accepting some money from the FBI for some work. So, Oswald got arrested after starting a fight down in New Orleans, in the area of Camp Street, with a man named Carlos Bringuier. He said he tried to befriend the guy, saying he was going to fight Castro, and then he said out in front of the shop he was starting to hand out leaflets saying he was pro-Castro. So he was just really trying to get himself into the middle of this debate, which happened on August 21st of 63 when he went on a radio station, FPCC, which against the FPCC, which is the Fair Play Cuba Committee. And he tried to successfully associate himself with that group and discredit that group. It was just like public theater, really trying to sell himself as being this pro-Castro type of figure, even though there was, we can believe otherwise, that he was actually taking money from the FBI at the time as like a double agent in the United States now, instead of being in the Soviet as a double agent. So Kennedy stated to Gene Daniel that he believed that the people of Cuba were suffering, but at the same time he wanted to not sponsor these ways of subverting the Cuban government. I guess he was trying to make peace with Castro and try to find another way, but the DOD and the American intelligence agencies just felt that, that we were beyond that point. You know, communism is the big evil, and if these guys went that route, well, it was too little, too late. Time to take these guys out instead of break bread with them. You know, so they almost looked at it as Kennedy was fraternizing with the enemy at this point. There was a group named Alpha 66, which was led by a man named Antonio Valencia. And he knew a CIA agent named Morris Bishop, but the guy was, I guess, publicly making his name David Phillips. He was going to testify in the House Senate Committee on Assassinations that he witnessed Oswald speaking with CIA agent Bishop in Dallas of '63. And the FBI actually tapped this guy Valencia on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you're going to be assassinated." I guess he was marked for assassination because he was running his mouth. And it turns out that he was shot in the head by an unknown gunman. And he survived. So this is a trend or a wave that we saw after the Kennedy assassination. There was a spat of murders that were very suspicious, and all of the people involved in these murders or suicides were all people that seem to have known something or been involved in intelligence some ways, linking Oswald to American intelligence agencies. And there was a very strong sentiment to suppress that information, to the point where people were getting killed in order to suppress that information. So this just kind of gives you the backstory on like what was going on in the world. You know, it wasn't just like Kennedy was killed and like life goes on. It was, there was a spat of murders and a spat of suspicious deaths. Just like I said, you know, I've already mentioned a few of them, and the list goes on. There's a lot more that, you know, maybe I'll get into some, maybe I won't, but there was quite a few of them. And it seems like right before the time that Kennedy was assassinated, there was somebody maybe impersonating Oswald. Like, we're talking like within a month or two of Kennedy's assassination, making Oswald look like he was a Soviet sympathizer. There's a recording of him from a embassy in Mexico, and of a man who spoke really bad Russian, claiming to be Oswald, asking to speak to one of the KGB's top agents on assassination, Valery Kostivov. So after the assassination of Kennedy, they used this information and this recording as proof that, oh yeah, this guy Oswald, he was, you know, look at him, he was speaking with Valery Kostivov, you know, right before the assassination. That's one of the KGB's top agents on assassination. But the recording has a man who speaks really bad Russian, and apparently Oswald was fluent in Russian. So something right there just doesn't jive. How the guy claiming to be Oswald, who called the embassy, you know, talking about some sort of business that they had to handle, spoke really bad Russian. So there was definitely some questions about Oswald going down to Mexico to fraternize with the KGB and, you know, to collude with the KGB on how to assassinate the president. You know, there was some huge question marks, you know, at the time. Um, there was some sort of an imposter, some sort of a person that looked like Oswald that they were taunting around, you know, just to kind of further their narrative of Oswald looking like a bad guy. They found a guy that actually looked like Oswald, and they had him out and about doing things. I'm going to kind of get into that a little bit more. But, you know, going to gun ranges, you know, just being an outright rude person to people. And during the time he was behaving like this, he was making comments to these people that, like, hey, I'll just go back to Russia. Like, he went to a car dealership and test drove a car and, like, sped it down the throughway doing almost 100 miles per hour, 85, 90 miles per hour, you know, really standing out to the sales guys like, whoa, what the hell's wrong with this guy? And then when he said, you know, your credit might not be good enough to get a car, he's like, oh, it's okay. I'll just go back to Russia and I get a car. You understand me? And then he went to a shooting range, and then somebody puts their paper up on a target, and he purposely started shooting the guy's target. If you've ever been to a shooting range, you know, I've been to a lot of shooting ranges, and you know, you put your own paper up, and you're competent enough to be shooting a gun. You're competent enough to be at a shooting range. You're damn well competent enough to know when you look forward in a straight line from where you're standing to where that target is. More than likely, if it's a pistol range or a short rifle range within a couple hundred yards, that your target is in front of you, and, you know, 10 feet over where the other guy's standing, his target is in front of him. And it's real easy not to be able to mix those targets up. You know, if you're competent enough to be pulling the trigger on a gun and shooting a gun, you're competent enough to be able to tell whose target is which. But this guy purposely was putting rounds on somebody else's paper, and you know, for the reason of pissing them off. And then, you know, after the guy looked at him, he gave him like a real evil look and made some sort of a comment to him. You know, like, he was just going around making himself stand out in really bad ways to people. And it's questionable because one of the times this guy was at the shooting range, Oswald was supposed to be in Mexico. So it's like this overzealous attitude from these intelligence agencies to make this Oswald double look like a bad guy, because ultimately when Oswald was basically thrown up as a patsy for the shooting of Kennedy, they would be able to double back and say, hey, yeah, he was doing this, he was doing that, he was, you know, down in Mexico City speaking to the KGB, he was at the gun range giving people attitudes, he went to the car dealership and he was running his mouth about Russia, you know, like they were really working overtime to make Oswald look like a bad guy. And this was probably unbeknownst to him at the time, after he was already marked to be the guy that was going to go down for killing Kennedy. You know, there was a lot of groundwork put into place that was sizing him up to be this person. So, yeah, I guess the name I mentioned before, Gene Daniel, it looks like it was some sort of like a liaison from Kennedy to Cuba. Gene Daniel, or it was another president. I think it was it some sort of French liaison? I'm not. There was just so many names in this book. I think he was a reporter, maybe. I'm just trying to just look that up real quick. I know he was with Castro when Kennedy was assassinated. Yeah. So, looks like he was some sort of a representative at some level, even. I don't know if it was public or secret, but he was some sort of a representative from Kennedy directly to Castro. So when Kennedy had a message that he wanted to get across to Castro, he would send this this representative over there. And Castro was pretty much pro-Kennedy. He actually wanted a truce, and he wanted Kennedy getting reelected for a second term. And Kennedy's assassination marked an end to that, and he sort of, you know, hoped that the United States and Cuba had. Kennedy, towards the end of his life, signed National Security Memorandum 263, which stated he was going to withdraw 1,000 of the 16,500 troops that were in South Vietnam out of Vietnam by the end of 1963, and by the end of 1965 he wanted 100% of the troops out, and he wanted the United States just playing a supporting role in whatever conflict that was going on there in South Vietnam with Diem and New, which was the president and vice president, his brother, that were running the South Vietnam at the time. And tapping on Kennedy's shoulder was Operation Northwoods, which was proposed by General Lemnitzer. And this is the lengths that the Department of Defense was going to at the time. They were going to get Cuba at any cost. False flag invasions, staged attacks. One of them was blowing up an empty jet over Cuba, stating it was hijacked, just to draw the Americans into a war. Like anything they had to do to start a war, they were looking for a fight, and they would even stage an event, a fake event, just to get the American public behind them to start a fight, which is scary if you think about, I don't know how many people would get behind that concept. But, they thought that they were fighting the big evil, and that it had to be done, and they needed a reason to get into a war with the Cubans. So, military-industrial complex looks at Kennedy like he was losing his mind because he was, trying to make peace with these guys, and they were trying to start war. So, big conflict between with the view of Kennedy and what he had of the world and where the world was going, and what the generals and what the military-industrial complex wanted. They even thought they could use nuclear weapons. Kennedy didn't want anything to do with Laos. He didn't want anything to do with the war in Laos, and he didn't want anything to do with the war in Vietnam. They were trying to pull him into a war. He became a very unpopular man, to the point where even stated by one of his, the first black Secret Service agent, Abraham Bolden. They used to joke around in the Secret Service and say, hey, if somebody takes a shot at Kennedy, who's getting out of the way first? They would make little jokes behind Kennedy's back that the Secret Service, that if somebody tried to kill Kennedy, like they effectively all would just jump out of the way. Which is crazy, to think about. Meanwhile, Diem in South Vietnam barely survived a 1960 coup. And there was generals trying to force an assault of the Berlin Wall, forcing Kennedy into conflict. Khrushchev wanted out of Laos. So it looked like Khrushchev was even kind of trying to shape his policies towards peace. Kennedy knew the French had tried a similar type of war in Vietnam, and it was an absolute tragedy, failure, and he didn't want the United States to go through the same thing. So he put another national security memorandum in place, 217. So he basically forbade at the time any sort of high-ranking civilian or military official from going to Vietnam without being cleared by the State Department office, because he didn't want them going over there meddling in the business over there, starting trouble that he would be responsible for having to send military troops over there for. So he just didn't trust them that much. So bad to where President Diem wanted some sort of national, instead of like battling and wanting war with the Soviets directly, he just was looking for some more national solidarity. So he kind of ramped down on religious freedom a bit, because he felt like that divided his country, or divided South Vietnam. And because the CIA knew that there was some internal conflict within the country, they played upon that. And apparently there was a bombing of a radio station, and it was staged by a CIA Captain Scott, who wanted the North Viet Cong to be responsible for inciting a war. And the plan actually backfired, and the Buddhists that were protesting because they wanted more religious freedom blamed DM. And DM found out about this because the explosives that were used were plastic based, and it was just like a fingerprint of the CIA at the time. So basically DM wanted the Americans out. Soon, right after that, immediately, he wanted 50% of the Americans out of the 16,500. He wanted 50% of them gone right after this event. He just felt like more trouble, having Americans in his country was more trouble than it was worth. Lo and behold, though, it was almost like the CIA was sponsoring the military of South Vietnam to want to overthrow him so they could basically have their fight, just kind of like the generals here in the United States were kind of fed up with Kennedy up at this point because they wanted their fight. They wanted Vietnam. And the generals of South Vietnam wanted to fight too. So they were kind of, they were looking to overthrow the current president for not doing more. And there was a secret war going on in Laos at the time. And I think they said it was something like 58,000 bombing missions, many of them sponsored by the CIA. And they were using a local people called the Hmong people. They were training them to fight, and they were basically becoming pawns in the game of almost like what happened in Vietnam, but in Laos. And they were using locals training, kind of like, let's say, what happened with the Bay of Pigs, where they were using exiles, but there they were just using like native mountain people. They were training them to fight and basically sending them to be soldiers for basically like a secret war against the communists through the CIA. Kennedy also had other enemies here on the home front when he stood toe-to-toe with American steel, which was ramping their prices up by $6 a ton. And there was so much money going into building an American steel, and how much of a backbone they were to the American economy. He felt like it was a slap in the face of the Americans that American steel would be doing this, so he stood toe-to-toe with them and made them back down by not giving them certain contracts, and eventually they all kind of caved. And there was even a Fortune article written, and it almost looked like it was being worded in the sense of like comparing Caesar's assassination. It said the Ides of April, steal the Ides of April. And Kennedy would have been, likened to Caesar. And he alienated himself, making him an enemy of one of the biggest industries in the U.S., which was also a huge part of the military-industrial complex. In the early 60s, James Jesus Angleton was running assassination teams through the CIA called ZR Rifle. It was run by William Harvey. At the time, they had a scope for how they would train assassins and how they could blame the Soviets or the Czechs if they were ever caught. Also around this time, the CIA had what they call a fake 201 file on their assassin. And lo and behold, Lee Harvey Oswald had a 201 file, and it was found out later on that the only people that had 201 files were members of the CIA that were under review, kind of like an internal review board. So the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald's name came up on a 201 file for the CIA is a huge tell that more than likely he was some sort of an agent or contractor for the CIA, because they would not have made a 201 file on him if he wasn't. This would only be done for a CIA employee or associate. So the fact that he had this file, again, was a telltale sign that Oswald was a agent or a contractor for the CIA, because there was a active 201 file on him for a review, because they felt like he was maybe like a disgruntled employee, and he had to be watched for whatever sort of leaks or situations he might be in. And it was a known, there was two people that stated when they were out in Japan working for the CIA that after the assassination, everybody at that station out in Japan was like, oh, what about the Oswald CIA connection? They thought it would have been world news, but apparently nobody talked about it. And these two people that did talk about it, that used to work for the CIA, had their tires slashed. I guess the girl Elsie died of cancer, and then Jim had some weird circle that appeared on his arm, and then he had some sort of like a nervous system condition afterwards. So again, that sounds suspicious, that these were people that spoke out against the link between Oswald and the CIA, and they both, or at least it seems like Jim, suffered a suspicious death because his nerve disorder was accompanied by an unknown circle on his arm. So that's strange. And then in September of '63, looks like a man named Richard Case Nigel, which a book was written out of him afterwards by a man named Dick Russell called The Man Who Knew Too Much. And the reason why he knew too much was his story starts off where he commits a felony by walking into a bank in El Paso and firing 2 shots from a .45 into a wall. And when he was arrested, he simply stated, "I would rather be arrested than commit murder and treason." He was a counterintelligence officer, and then he worked as a Soviet counterintelligence officer in Tokyo, and I guess he was part of a plot through the KGB as a double agent to try to thwart the plan that some members from Alpha 66 were plotting to kill Kennedy, and Oswald was going to be set up as a patsy for it. Apparently the Soviets knew about this plan, so they tasked Nigel with letting Oswald know, and apparently David Atlee Phillips was the handler of Angel and Leopoldo, these guys from these Cuban exiles from Alpha 66, who was part of one of those groups that the CIA was using to incite war in Cuba and draw the U.S. into a war. So back to Nigel, he was tasked through the KGB to let Oswald know, like, you're getting dragged into this plot here to kill the president, man. You need to cut it out. You need to do something to stop this. And the KGB was on Nigel because they said, if you don't get him to stop, or you have to kill this guy Oswald, because we don't want to take the fall for Kennedy's assassination, because that's what's going to happen. They're going to do this. They're going to frame Oswald, and they're going to say Oswald was working with the Soviets, and we're going to get dragged into this whole mess. And we really don't want anything to do with it. So after Nigel met Oswald, he said Oswald seemed like he was pretty much unresponsive to the information that Nigel was giving him. So he didn't want to kill Oswald because he felt like he'd be killing an agent of the CIA and therefore committing treason. And if he did nothing, he would be kind of complicitly knowing that the president was going to be killed, not doing anything about stopping a plot to kill the president. So instead of kind of putting himself in a bad place or a bad place, he decided to take option three, which was to commit a felony, knowing that if he committed a felony, he would wind up doing some time in federal prison, which he did wind up doing. He did about 5 years, and he said he did it because he felt like that was the one place that they couldn't get to him. If he went to federal prison, then he would be committing a felony, shooting a firearm at a bank, would get him 4 years in federal prison, and it would remove him from the plot to kill Kennedy, and it would also remove him from having to kill Oswald. So it was like a plan C that he came up with on his own, which was effectively the smartest thing he could have did, because either the first two, he would have been more than likely dead himself for getting involved in these situations or imprisoned, and he did the lesser of all the evils by doing what he did. Right before Nigel walked into the bank in September, late September, and fired the bullets that got him 4 years in federal prison, he sent a letter on September 17th to Hoover, how he was supposed to take care of Oswald and stop this plot, and he said that the assassination attempt would take place in '63, somewhere around Washington, D.C. Funny enough, right around that time, Oswald stated to the Communist Party, he wrote a letter to them saying he would be in Washington around that time. If there was a plot to kill Kennedy in Washington around late September of '63, Oswald said he was going to be in that area, and that kind of lined up with what Nigel was saying about where Oswald would be and why he would be there. So it seems like maybe Nigel would have prevented Kennedy's assassination for at least 2 months. Maybe it was supposed to go down earlier. It seems like by all intents and purposes, there were other plots and plans to have Kennedy assassinated prior to November of '63, and intelligence agencies in the United States knew damn well that these plots and plans were in place. And Nigel also said that he sat down with Angel and a guy named Aracha. His name was Sergio Aracha Smith, and Oswald was there. They all had a meeting about how they were going to kill Kennedy, and Nigel had a tape. And Garrison, who was I believe Garrison, who was if you've ever seen the movie JFK, the Oliver Stone movie from 1991, Garrison was the character that Kevin Costner played. He basically looked at this guy Nigel as like, this guy's like the most important witness we could find. The problem is, after he got out of prison, there was a couple attempts made on his life, and I think he struck a deal and basically said he would be quiet and would stop trying to make trouble regarding his role in this assassination, to thwart the assassination and the links between all of the people in the intelligence agencies. And I think, if he would be left alone, he would shut his mouth. Apparently he had these tapes hidden somewhere in a purple trunk somewhere in storage. In 1995, the Assassinations Records Review Board mailed him a letter, and they wanted him to testify. And then soon after he was asked to testify, again, conveniently, they find him dead in his bathroom. And he had great health right up until the time that he was asked to testify. Next thing you know, he started to lose his equilibrium, and the next thing you know, they found him dead. And a local coroner stated that it would be possible to induce a heart attack without a trace, and he didn't really find any traces, and his house was ransacked after his death. So even though his son checked the storage unit for the trunk that he spoke was there, his house was soon ransacked after he died. So another suspicious death associated with Kennedy's assassination. September, same month that Nigel went to prison, a woman named Sylvia Odio had 3 men visit her house: Leopoldo, Angel, and a man named Leon Oswald. Again, Leopoldo and Angel are associated with Alpha 66. Alpha 66 associated with the CIA, doing attacks on ships in the Cuban harbor to start a war with the United States, and Oswald is being seen multiple places with these two individuals. So link again. They were stating that they were members of the Junta Revolucionaria Cubana, group that Sylvia's parents were well known, and Manila Ray was a leader of JURE, and it was a threat to the CIA, effectively, and an ally to Kennedy. Her dad, Amador, was the reason that they wanted to introduce Leon Oswald to the group. And Amador told his daughters, do not get involved with these guys. I don't know who they are, but I don't think you should get involved with them. She was not asked to testify at the Warren Commission, even though she would have been able to substantiate some sort of link between these members of a CIA secret group and Leon Oswald. But she was not asked to testify, which makes you scratch your head. Like I said, the Warren Commission was not a commission that was actually tasked with trying to solve or prove the truth about what happened to Kennedy. It was more a group that was specifically constructed to sell the lone gunman theory to the public. That is the only purpose of the Warren Commission. It was a very one-sided, non-truthful committee who cherry-picked everything they could just to sell the lone gunman theory and ignored everything that didn't fit that box. So this was some more information that had come forward about that there. And privately, Kennedy around this time was trying to save Diem's life. South Vietnamese president. His Secretary of State, what was it, Henry Cabot Lodge, was actually not, it didn't seem like he was a friend or an ally of Kennedy, and Moore was going out there to try to support the agenda of the CIA and their willingness to want to overthrow the South Vietnamese president at the time, so they could get some generals in there who were about going to war with the communists. And North Vietnamese at the time, their president was Ho Chi Minh. So Kennedy even bypassed all official channels at the time and sent a former Harvard classmate from Massachusetts named Torbert McDonald, who was going to warn Diem that he was going to be killed, bypassing all official channels to do so. And right around this time, the Baron disappeared from the picture. I think he got some sort of an oil contract with, I think it was Haiti, for quite a bit of money. I forget how much. I think it was like $285,000. So I think that was kind of like the trade-off that the Baron was getting for working for the CIA, doing, if they told him to do this or do that, take this guy Oswald under your wing, introduce him to the town, hook him up with some Russians in a certain neighborhood, do what you gotta do to get him and his wife situated. Him and his wife, what is it, Marina? But I guess because of maybe the link that the Baron would have had to the CIA that was very much provable at the time. Maybe they thought it was smarter off that he should disappear from Oswald's life. Maybe hand them off to a new group of friends, which he did. They were named Ruth and Michael Payne. But they were also a couple with CIA connections to Allen Dulles. After Kennedy's assassination, Marina, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, was warned by the Secret Service not to talk to Ruth Payne any longer because of her close ties to the CIA. Believe it or not, it was Ruth Payne who facilitated Oswald's job at the Texas Book Depository in October of 1963. Because I believe he started working at the book depository only about 6 weeks before the assassination or something to that effect. Even though a Texas Trans airline offered Oswald a job for $100 a month more. For some reason, Oswald decided that he would take the job that would pay $100 a month less, but also, in the fate of history, would put him directly in the path of President Kennedy's motorcade 5 weeks later. Kennedy even also started getting the vibes that Washington was on a possible verge of a possible coup. That's how much tension was against Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs of Staff's Department of Defense against, him trying to make these peace channels with Khrushchev, him supporting President Lumumba, and also at the time he supported these independent nations like Lumumba, who the CIA thought sympathized with the Soviets, and I think it was President Sukarno, and they also viewed him as a sympathizer of the Soviets and the communists, and that they supported, that they felt these countries supported communism and were more of a threat because eventually they were going to fall, and if they fell, it would be like the domino effect. So in order to get ahead of the curve, they had to cut countries like this down, support military coups where these guys would be, these presidents who were trying to have their countries away from, for example, the Congo. I think it was under Belgium rule. They wanted to free themselves of Belgium rule and be independent, but, eventually they were viewed as threats because of that. They were viewed as, oh, you're going to be independent, and then you'll be acclimated to the communists, and then before you know it, you'll fall, and the country next to you will fall, and the country next to you will fall, and it'll be like a domino effect. Before you know it, all these countries are falling to communism, and then our enemies just got much bigger and much more powerful. So, this was their view, as they were trying to cut these countries down before they had a chance to, become a direct threat. Kennedy was also using Cuba's UN ambassador Carlos Lechuga to try to build relations back to Cuba at the time. Soviet espionage supervisor who worked for the FBI named Marvin Giesling canceled a flash on Oswald that would have put him right on the watch list before Kennedy's assassination on October 9th. No reason, absolutely no reason, that this man should have got a flash, which was like a security risk notification that Oswald would have been near the president or working near the president during the time of a motorcade coming through his area. His name should have came up on this flash list, and therefore he would have been not allowed to be in the area of president's motorcade if there was this flash on him. But for some reason, even though he stated that he would give U.S. secrets to the Soviets publicly, he was taken off this list, which is, I'd say, beyond suspicious. Unless Oswald was working with the FBI or working with the CIA or some intelligence agency that would deem them to overlook some sort of a security risk like that, at least publicly, unless privately there was something more going on, which is right around the time that I believe Oswald was probably coming back from Mexico City. The term was being thrown around of sheep dipping. So this is a new term that I've never heard before in my own life. Sheep dipping. Like, what is sheep dipping? It was the process. Well, in reality, what sheep dipping is, it's when they dip sheep in some sort of a chemical and they kill all the parasites of the sheep. But the term being thrown in the world of intelligence of sheep dipping is like this imposter that was being thwarted around flaunted around in Mexico City publicly, to really, even though if it was somebody impersonating him with a really bad accent, recorded on a CIA secret line of him speaking with the KGB's top assassination expert. They were really trying to make him look like a Soviet and Cuba sympathizer, and that's how the term sheep dipping was. They were going above and beyond to like even have people that sounded like Oswald, that looked like Oswald, to go do things that to the public would almost like, wash their hands of him, in the sense that he wouldn't be associated with the CIA. He wouldn't be associated with being a double agent. He would be associated to the public as being a sympathizer, as being a bad guy, as being a communist. But the crazy thing, this is certainly not a coincidence, that when he went to Mexico City, his travel card number was 824085. And I would say, not coincidentally, the next card purchased as a travel card number was a CIA employee, William Gaudet, 824084. That is certainly not a coincidence that Oswald just happened to travel to Mexico City right in line with a man that happened to be a CIA agent, So effectively, like, these travel cards were effectively purchased one by one. And Kennedy was getting tired of Henry Cabot Lodge trying to undermine him and, support this coup or stage a coup in South Vietnam. So he actually sent Defense Secretary McNamara and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Taylor, trying to take a secret mission out to Vietnam to try to withdraw troops and try to put this American force to an end there. He kind of went against the CIA's plan to have a full-scale war in Vietnam. And it was well known afterwards, at the time, maybe not at the time, but now we know that all aspects of the American government, facilitated by Army Air Force Fletcher Prouty, used the term back then. The term was called spooks or agents. That was the term used in the 60s for these people that would be intelligence operatives that were planted in the government, in all aspects of the government. So Kennedy kind of knew this, that everywhere he would turn, he would get this blowback, and he kind of felt like everybody was being subverted, like there was agents of intelligence in every aspect of the government that he would try to get work done or try to stop this impending war from happening, either in Vietnam or with the Soviets. And I had already explained about National Security Memorandum 263. And when Kennedy sent Taylor and McNamara out to Vietnam to try to get the troops out of there and kind of quell this military coup that was going to be going on, they were thwarted by Henry Cabot Lodge. Through Hillsman and Mike Forrestal, because they wanted to incite a coup. David Bell, who worked for a CIA front business, Committee Aid Import Program, was going to pull the funding to support the South Vietnamese government, effectively making it ripe for the taking by military generals. The generals looked at this cutoff of financial support to the South Vietnamese government as a sign that it was time for a coup. And it's the sign that they asked for. So when Henry Cabot Lodge met with DM, he stated something that was mistranslated, because it's the native language, Jani Vas Pas Servir, and that's translated to "I will not serve." And maybe Henry Cabot Lodge thought it meant "I will not give in." He just basically says, "I'm not going to serve as a puppet for the American government," even though he was willing to modify some of his behavior to try to work with the American government to come to some sort of a conclusion for this these problems that his country was experiencing. November 1st, DM decided that he was going to comply with the Americans, and Henry Cabot Lodge saw to it that a very slow message about this got back to the American government, which was too late because the military coup had already began. And also, right around this time, Special Agent Martineu foiled a Chicago November 2nd plot to kill Kennedy, and this is publicly known. It turns out that there's a lot of connections and similarities in the November 2nd plot in Chicago to kill Kennedy to the Dallas plot. More than likely, it was known that after Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in New Orleans, he started to become an FBI informant. And it turns out that after Nugel spoke with him, maybe some of that information sunk in about what he was stating about the plot that he was going to be dragged into being a patsy for Kennedy's murder, because even though the special agent foiled the November 2nd plot, the reason why he foiled the plot is because a FBI informant named Lee contacted the FBI and talked about the Chicago plot to kill Kennedy. And it wasn't just one person involved. it looked like it was pretty much what effectively happened in Dallas was going to happen in Chicago. There was, the informant stated it was a team, correctly heard, a team of snipers. 4 men. 4 men were going to use high-power rifles to kill Kennedy in Chicago on November 2nd. And as this information was coming out, a man who effectively fit the exact profile as Lee Harvey Oswald, almost like note for note to a T, that Thomas Arthur Valley, he was considered a paranoid schizophrenic gunman who would fit the lone nut profile as Oswald. He was the same type of person, the same type of character that would fit the lone gunman profile. He was considered a loner, paranoid schizophrenic, and his arrest was affected by the Chicago police. The informant Lee stated that a team, again I stated a team of assassins, would be responsible for assassinating Kennedy. The plot was foiled, and when we look at the individual that more than likely would have been the patsy in Chicago, his name was, again, Thomas Arthur Valley. He had a strikingly similar background to Lee Harvey Oswald. They both worked for the CIA in regards to U-2 spy planes, both pawns in a CIA game for scapegoats for Kennedy's assassination. Only in the sense of Valley, the plan that circled around him was thwarted, and he had a job at a lithograph company 3 stories above Kennedy's parade route on November 2nd in Chicago, which would have made him for a perfect patsy if a 4-man assassination team killed the president in Chicago. They could blame it on Valley, who was clearly on the parade route, clearly had the shot at him, and you know, a very similar type of situation that actually occurred in Dallas. So right around that time that this plan's being thwarted, Diem and New are both killed by generals. They, I think they met them at a church, and they were saying, "Oh, we're going to take you to the palace," and the generals were like, "Why are we being taken in tanks?" And the tanks took them from the church to the palace, and by the time they got to the palace, they were both dead. Both had multiple gunshot wounds, stab wounds. So these generals basically, kind of like Caesar getting killed by the Senate, they stabbed and they shot the president president's brother, the president, vice president of South Vietnam, were murdered. Lumumba was overthrown, and he was also killed, and it was sponsored by the CIA. So I had mentioned the name Abraham Bolden. He was the first black Secret Service agent hand-selected by President Kennedy. And he stated that in January of '64, new Secret Service IDs were issued. This is relevant because the man who was dropped off, and this is just off the top of my head, I'm going to get into my notes of this section. The man who was dropped off who was witnessed to be dropped off in a green pickup truck, I believe, that Jack Ruby was driving. He actually dropped the man off that walked up to the grassy knoll and got behind the fence, and then was also witnessed to have taken out a rifle and shoot the president, and then toss the rifle to a man wearing railroad worker clothing. Soon afterwards, you know, we're talking seconds after the assassination, a officer ran up the hill, Officer Smith, and this man produced some sort of identification that got the officer off his back. So at this time he was unarmed because he had immediately thrown the rifle to a man wearing railway worker clothing, who broke the rifle down, stuffed it into a bag, and ran down the railroad tracks immediately after the assassination. So the man who fired the kill shot was actually stopped by police almost immediately after he shot the president. And the thing that was missing, because it was, you know, very much planned execution, was the rifle, because he had already gotten rid of it seconds prior to a police officer running up to him and pulling out a pistol on him and telling him not to move. But then, after challenged by the police, he was able to produce identification, which identified him as Secret Service. And it turns out afterwards that there was no Secret Service on that hill. And even the officer said afterwards, I thought it was strange that this guy, he looked almost more like an auto mechanic than he did a Secret Service agent. You know, his nails were dirty. He remembered the guy. And the Secret Service knew at that point that they had been infiltrated. There were people there in Dallas on the afternoon of the assassination that were not only dressed as Secret Service agents, they were dressed as police officers. I'm going to get more into this. I have a little bit more further, but I know, just again off the top of my head, there was a man shooting film right under the trajectory that would have been like the bullet from the grassy knoll, the fence. So wherever that gunshot came from, there was a man under there on the hill. And basically the bullet flew over his head. And he said he felt and, you know, heard the bullet come from behind him up the hill. And seconds after the president was assassinated, they had men wearing police uniforms coming at him, pointing guns at him, demanding that he empty his camera and give the video up. Now think about this for a second. If the president was just assassinated, do you really think that the #1 priority of anybody in law enforcement or anybody in that area would have been to confiscate video of the assassination? Seconds, you know, pointing guns at people, demanding video from them. So, you know, to me that sounds like a bit of damage control. You know, some of these guys that were dressed as police officers, and they weren't really police officers, and the Secret Service agent, which wasn't really a Secret Service agent, you know, they were trying to do some damage control right away because they saw a guy with a camera in his hand and they knew that that was going to be damaging to the public, like the Zapruder film eventually was. You know, which took 12 years to be released to the public after the Warren Commission, which was damning to the testimony and conclusion of the Warren Commission, because it clearly shows a shot coming from the front, you know, forcing the president's head backwards. And if you even look at the blood spatter, it goes backwards. You know, just like you would imagine if somebody got shot in the head from the front with a rifle, their head would jerk back into the side, you know, which is exactly what happened. Clear as day in the, you could see it in the Zapruder film, clear as day. So that's exactly the opposite of the conclusion of the Warren Commission again. You know, but, you know, unfortunately, after the case was basically closed in the eyes of the government, this video surfaced 12 years later, you know, and, like, not much was done about it. You know, there was just, it seems like these organizations were infiltrated so bad, and so many people were so scared because all these suspicious deaths, you know, if they, so like a doctor said, you know, if they could kill a president, think about that for a second. Just wrap your head around that. The people responsible for killing the president are still out there and operating. You know, you really think anybody's safe? which is scary, you know. It's scary to think about, you know, in a country that's supposed to be the land of the free, the home of the brave, that, you know, we have to worry about being silenced by some silent military coup that existed within this country, threatening and murdering people. But that appears to be the reality of what happened. So, you know, that's kind of like circling back to what I said about the Secret Service agent Boulder. There was a need in January of '64 to revamp and reissue and reconfigure all Secret Service IDs. Why do you think that they did that? What do you think the big push was? Because the Secret Service had clearly known internally that they were infiltrated, and that there were men out there that morning that were claiming to be Secret Service agents. What is the Secret Service number one job? What is their number one job? To protect the president. And when you've been hit so bad, and when you've been compromised so bad, that people that were responsible for killing the president had identification badges in their pockets that were identical to the ones being held by Secret Service, as confirmed by the police officer who stopped one of these individuals, who then produced identification to this police officer, and that was good enough for that police officer at the given time to let this man go. And the given man, by all intents and purposes, was the man that fired the kill shot that killed President Kennedy. So he was actually caught, and he was, you know, probably going to be held, minus the fact that he had a Secret Service identification badge on him, which was clearly issued in some sort of secret channel illegally by some intelligence agency, you know. And this was not just one police officer. This was this encounter with this man, and the actions of this man were witnessed from a man standing on the overpass. Clearly a man who was watching this man for at least, what, 15, 20 minutes, half hour before the assassination, watching him, watching the railroad worker. We had a first-hand witness who had eyes on the president's shooter, the main shooter. I believe there was a second shooter from the 6th floor of the book depository. The storyline, I guess, this is what, and this is, I guess, what Douglas was saying in his book, that the storyline for Kennedy's assassination would have been that, like, Kennedy sponsored Castro's death, which failed, a la Bay of Pigs, and in retaliation he was killed by a Castro lone nut supporter. And I guess that's how it would have been sold to the public, or that's how they were eventually trying to sell it to the public. And that's a la the Warren Commission. Lee Harvey Oswald, lone nut Castro supporter. Maybe not funded by Castro, but just a lone nut, a loose cannon, a wild card, some sort of anomaly. You know, easy way to have a whole lot go into a situation like this. A very complicated, well-orchestrated hit on a standing leader of the most powerful nation in the world, and then have it all go away. That's the quickest way to do it, is to blame it on some lone gunman, some guy that, you know, just had some wild ideas. So you can just sell it to the public like that, and the public's not going to be absolutely outraged that there's all these connections for all these people, all these situations that were swept under the carpet about the other assassination plot in Chicago on November 2nd, which had links to a man named Lee, who was an FBI informant. And we know that Nagel, who was the KGB agent, spoke with Lee Harvey Oswald and let him know about the plot that was going on in September. And we know, like these things start to, when you keep taking steps back and you start looking at what's going on here, you start to see a pattern, We know that he's associated with these people from Cuba, these exiles who are working for the CIA, doing these missions to drag the United States into an all-out war with Cuba. Oswald is associated with these people. This team of snipers are brought into Chicago, and you have this patsy type of character like an Oswald, easy to point the finger at him and say, hey, yeah, it was that guy all along. That guy's just a nut. I mean, just, talk to him for a couple minutes. All the, schizophrenic, all that stuff, man. The guy's just crazy. He went and did something crazy. It's real easy to blame that guy. You had this situation going on. You had all this known. You had this known by the FBI. You had, there was a lot of people in the world of intelligence who damn well knew what was going on by the time Dallas happened. Clearly, there's people that were infiltrating these areas. There's that situation I already explained about the car and the man that during the time that Oswald was supposed to be in Mexico, somehow a man with the name Oswald also was flamboyantly making a bad name for himself at a car dealership as being someone associated with the Russians. Like, you had these unexplainable situations that could only really be explained by having some sort of like a double agent in this sheep-dipping type of intelligence agency situation going on, where you had a second person acting out this role of a very disenchanted, angry, Soviet sympathizing, Cuban sympathizing Lee Harvey Oswald, a guy that looked like him, a guy that a lot of people later on when they saw him on TV would be mistaken for him. Because when you talk to his wife after, that is not the kind of man he was. He was actually taking books out of a library that were pro-Kennedy. He was having talks at a college in August, warning the American public of a possible coup. This was the actual Lee Harvey Oswald, if you really start pulling back the layers of who this guy was. Easy to kind of paint him to be the bad guy. There was the Dallas Sports Dome, where this man was September 27th, who many stated was Lee Harvey Oswald, pointing his rifle and adjusting his scope, pulled his car up in the middle of the night and turned his headlights on, like made himself stand out as somebody who was just being strange. But it was Oswald, but yet Oswald was supposed to be in Mexico City on September 27th. Again, according to Douglas, and this is apparently what it looks like, an overzealous intelligence operation. Really, really, really trying to sheep dip this guy Oswald. You really got to make him look like a bad guy. You try a little too hard, and unfortunately you have too many Oswalds walking around, and they can't bilocate, because as of right now in 2024, bilocation is not something that's real. It's the work of science fiction. So Oswald couldn't have been in Mexico City and at the Dallas Sports Dome on the same day. One, Oswald speaking with the head assassination expert of the KGB, recorded on a CIA line with a poor Russian accent, knowing that the real Harvey Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, had a perfect Russian accent. And secondly, in the second location, at the Dallas Sports Dome, turning his headlights on at a target, sighting his scope. Just weeks before the president's assassination, standing out to people in a negative way. And there was another badly spelled letter 13 days before the assassination of President Kennedy that was supposedly typed by Lee Harvey Oswald, sent to the Soviet embassy. It was painting Oswald to be associated with this guy, Valery Vladimirovich Kostigov, which is the head KGB assassination expert. So another letter surfaces, basically pointing Oswald in the direction of being this, you know, type of character. After Kennedy was assassinated, it seemed like Lyndon Johnson was all for, and the reason, the impetus for the Warren Commission. Effectively, afterwards, it was almost like he stated that, well, the CIA couldn't have been associated with doing this. That was a no-go. And also, all that sheep dip and all that hard work to paint Oswald to be this, you know, Soviet sympathizer, or so working with the Soviets via this assassination expert, that was a no-go also, because this could spark a war that would kill 40 million people in one day. You know, we're talking a nuclear war, where we spoke about the damaging power of nuclear weapons and how a thermonuclear weapon could effectively evaporate all of New York City in the blink of an eye, and how dangerous these things are. Just how insanely dangerous it is for any one person to have access to that kind of power. So we can clearly see why world disarmament of nuclear weapons was a very big agenda for President Kennedy, because it's a problem to have like right now, for example, to have the threat of having someone like Vladimir Putin able to access use of thermonuclear weapons. Oh, and the badly typed letter was stating terms like time to complete our business, made it sound very surreptitious. Like, we're going to complete our business. We're not going to talk about what our business is, but it's time to complete it. And then when the Warren Commission produced this letter later, it was more like sanitized, like, well, time to assist me in getting some certain travel documents. It's just another example of how the Warren Commission was this sham job to effectively, at all costs, create this lone gunman persona and stick with it and have that the story sold to the American public. And then, again, here's just some supporting information that, you know, there was a couple of evaluations that were made. The Net Evaluation Subcommittee and a preemptive Soviet strike would result in, I thought it was 40 million, but it's saying, I have here 140 million. I think it was 40 million. But Kennedy, regardless, it's a lot of people, you know, either way, it's still a ton of people. Kennedy actually walked out of this meeting with this Net Evaluation Subcommittee in disgust, and he said, and we call ourselves the human race. He was that disgusted that they were talking about a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, and the fact that they were even thinking about that, and how it would just kill so many people. And there were certain people within our government that were A-OK with that. Hey, it's just the cost of doing business, right? That was their attitude. But by the time they re-evaluated this second Net subcommittee in 1963, they said, well, the Soviet Union's probably going to strike back at us, and we're at least talking about 30 million Americans dying. So I don't know if we want to start that fight. I think that's always kind of been the bone of contention. MAD, mutual assured destruction. And I think that's what the term is, MAD. And, you know, it's the reason probably why we haven't seen nuclear weapons being used in a war since World War II. Because during World War II, it was a one-sided deal. But now, with the threat of you lobbing a nuclear bomb at your enemy and them lobbing a nuclear bomb back, you know, you lose an eye, I lose an eye, you know, so you're not getting out of this untouched, and I'm not getting out of this untouched. So maybe it's just smarter that we both kind of don't even go there, because it's a lose-lose situation. By the end of '63, the Soviet Union had hardened their nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles to the extent where a preemptive strike would not be propitious. Now, moving forward, a couple days before the assassination, a couple came into Redbird Airfield And the person working there, Wayne January, denied the couple rental because they were asking very strange questions. And they had a man sitting in the back of their car, which he later identified as Lee Harvey Oswald, or somebody that looked like Lee Harvey Oswald. But it was almost like they were sheep dipping again. How far can this plane go? If we were to take it, how long would we have to refuel? They were asking very, very strange questions, almost to the point where, like, if we were going to fly it to Cuba, how long could we go before we had to stop and refuel? To the point where he denied them the rental of the plane and remembered that he saw Lee Harvey Oswald in the back of the car. You know, again, mission accomplished, because this would be one of the guys that would come out afterwards, and the Warren Commission actually did not use his testimony because it looked like they wanted to cover this connection up. Another person who had a very strange death and a very interesting encounter with authorities was Rose Cheramy, who apparently was either a dancer or a prostitute. I think she was associated with Jack Ruby's club at some point. But Cheramy definitely said that she was with Sergio Aracha Smith and Emilio Santana. Double Agent Nagel for the KGB, if you remember him, I was talking about, identified as Sergio Aracha Smith and Emilio Santana were the people that she was hanging out with on a previous night, who stated that they were going to kill Kennedy. And she was talking about this days before, 2 days before the assassination. She was talking about this. And nobody listened to her because she was just some drug addict that was withdrawing at a hospital. She was later found dead in very suspicious circumstances years later, with a possible gunshot wound to her head, lying in the middle of the road in September of '65. So she was a loose end for sure. And apparently that loose end was tied up in the form of her dying in a very suspicious manner. Originally they thought some guy ran her over with a car because they said her head was crushed, but then they found some sort of evidence that there may have been a close contact gunshot wound to her head beforehand. So she might have been killed, placed in the road, only to have somebody accidentally run her over and then make it look like she was killed by a hit and run type of situation. Even Castro said on November 23rd, Castro knew right away, because he made a bunch of comments that I'm sure weren't made public at the time. Castro stated on November 23rd, how strange would he be publicly disclosing U.S. secrets to the Soviet Union and not be sent to jail? How strange that he goes to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union rejects him and he finds himself a job in Texas, and his trip was paid for by the U.S. even after claiming to renounce his citizenship. How strange, right? Castro said that right away. Right away, Castro knew that Oswald was a intelligence agent. And he made a comment about it. And that was Castro effectively commenting on, yeah, it's no mistake this guy was where he was, and, you know, the path that he was on, you know, this isn't by error. Because meanwhile, Castro was trying to make peace with Kennedy. So back to Dealey Plaza, 11 a.m., November 22nd. A woman named Julianne Mercer saw a green pickup truck deliver the man with a rifle wrapped in newspaper. The man driving the truck was Jack Ruby. She positively identified him the day before he killed Oswald. Statements were present to the Warren Commissioner that she said she signed, but she actually didn't sign anything. So it looks like there were some forged documents that made it look like she wasn't sure who she saw on the grassy knoll. But she publicly stated in all, since she kind of lost the maiden name, and I think she took on her husband's name. She didn't want to be found in being a witness to something so serious, but she undoubtedly identified Jack Ruby as the person who was driving that pickup truck. So Jack Ruby was seen at the site of the Kennedy assassination an hour and a half before Kennedy was assassinated, dropping a man off who was then known to have shot one of the rifles that was responsible, and more than likely the kill shot. So the man that had the kill shot on President Kennedy, Jack Ruby, was seen dropping him off and was witnessed by a first-hand witness. And we have the woman's name, and she never recanted her story. Again, CIA around that time also viewed Sukarno, a communist supporter. Kennedy's National Security Action Memorandum 179 in August of '62 ordered the CIA and the Department of Defense to stand towards and take a stance towards Indonesia. They were not happy. After Kennedy's assassination, Sukarno was overthrown, house arrested, and died of poor health. After the headshot that killed Kennedy was fired from the grassy knoll, stated by so many witnesses right there, people that felt the bullet, heard the bullet, could feel the wind of the bullet, they could smell the gunpowder of the bullet right there on the top of that hill behind that fence. And there was definitely evidence afterwards of footprints, and they said cigarette butts and somebody standing right behind that fence when they went up there. The officer, his name was Joe Marshall Smith. He's the one that ran up the grassy knoll and smelled the gunpowder immediately. And that's when the man with the dirty fingernails who was standing there produced Secret Service ID. Gordon Arnold was the man who was trying to shoot some film from the top of the hill, and he was persuaded away multiple times by false Secret Service agents. Were telling him to get the hell out of there, stop standing over there. These were guys that were not Secret Service. It was confirmed afterwards. There were no Secret Service agents on the top of that hill. Not real ones, at least. But apparently there was more than one person that came forward stating that somebody claiming to be Secret Service was standing up top of that hill and scaring people away and telling them to get the hell out of there. And two men wearing police uniforms ran up to him right after the shooting and told him to give him the film on the camera that he was shooting with. This is where we get into the information about Ed Hoffman, who worked at Texas Instruments. He was deaf and mute. He witnessed the man wearing the suit speaking with the railroad worker back there in the parking lot behind the fence on top of the grassy knoll. He saw the suit man. He was wondering, why is this suit man talking to this railroad worker? Like, what are these guys doing? This is so strange. You know, he was deaf and he was mute, so he was hanging out there on top of the bridge that Kennedy was about to drive under, standing by himself, looking, watching before the, 15, 20 minutes plus before Kennedy's motorcade drove through. And he was kind of just observing, because he said his senses are in tune because he's deaf, he's got real sharp vision. And he was watching this railroad worker talk to this suit man and wondering why these two guys talking. They seemed like an unlikely pair to be speaking. It was just kind of strange to him. Then all of a sudden he saw a puff of smoke from behind the hill, and he saw the man wearing the suit toss a gun, a rifle, to the railroad worker, who then, again, like I said, broke it down, stuffed it into a sack that a worker might have, like a little satchel, like a little handbag satchel. Then the guy took off running down the tracks, right as Officer Joe Marshall Smith ran up the hill and pointed a gun at him. And he questioned him. And then that's when he produced the ID, and Officer Smith said, "Hey, this guy must be Secret Service. I'm going to leave him alone." Meanwhile, the reality of what this guy was looking at, he couldn't imagine in a million years. The guy he was talking to was President Kennedy's killer, standing right there, right there. He had him, dead to rights. But, they had, it was so well orchestrated that these guys had their bases covered. The gun was already gone seconds after the assassination, and the worker was able to produce valid ID, which satisfied the inquiry of a police officer who was going to question this man about why he was standing near an area that smelled like gunpowder after the president had just been shot, which would be your gut reaction, especially when they all heard the gunshot come from right up in that area. That's why the officer ran up there. So even the police officer heard it, and that's why he ran up the hill. So Ed Hoffman saw all this go down, and he went and told his uncle around Christmas time, who was a Dallas detective, and his uncle said, hey, you better keep quiet about this. Eventually he went behind his dad and his uncle's back, and he said, I'm going to the FBI. And they offered him $500 to keep his mouth shut. His dad and his uncle went to the FBI and said, Ed might not know what he's talking about. He's kind of like, he might be mistaken on what he's talking about. And more than likely, Dad and Uncle saved Ed's life because nobody really believed him, because he had such a hard time translating his story without a translator because of his disability. The fact he was deaf and he had problem talking. He was mute, because he can't hear the tones. It's hard to talk with some people who are deaf. So because of his disability, he had a very hard time communicating what he saw with the FBI. But he was able to get enough across where they were willing to offer him $500 to shut his mouth, even though he had so much trouble speaking. So eventually his dad and uncle convinced the FBI maybe he didn't see what he thought he saw. Maybe he's just mistaken. And ultimately, I think that saved Ed's life, because I think Ed was a little bit too good of a witness for what he saw, considering the other people that died suspicious deaths. I have no doubt that, Ed would have been expendable if he caused enough of a problem with what he had witnessed. As far as a little background on the reissue of the badges to the Secret Service in 1964, there was a Sidley Bottold, chief of CIA's Technical Services Division, furnished the Secret Service badges. How the hell did this guy, and the question is, get access to furnishing people with Secret Service badges? This was a division that he shouldn't have had any dealing in, under the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, under the Treasury Department. It's very possible this guy could have got his hands on some fake IDs for some of these guys that were there, or somebody with his clearance working through the CIA. And then also during the Warren Commission, they found out that, first off, this wasn't the Warren Commission. They found out that President Kennedy's last communications with Khrushchev were delayed. Almost seems like they're saying through clerical error, but maybe there was more to it than that, in his efforts to make peace with Khrushchev. The Secret Service that were working the Dallas detail wanted security pulled. They violated security protocol by making a less than 44-mile-per-hour turn, making Kennedy an easy target. So almost as if there was some sort of internal breach. Again, this wouldn't be the first time we've seen it. Deputy Sheriff Craig saw Oswald, or an Oswald look-alike, run down the grassy knoll into a green Dodge Rambler driven by a husky-looking Latin. Then they drove off to a neighborhood where they know that Officer Tippit was killed afterwards by supposedly Oswald. Funny enough, though, a woman that wasn't called to testify stated she saw the shooter to be a short, husky-looking Latin man, and he threw a gun to a taller man. Multiple witnesses saw the Green Rambler by the book depository. And also, it was stated multiple times that Oswald actually left the book depository by city bus. And they stated when he talked about the car and anything that might have been going on at Daily Plaza, he stated that everyone's gonna know who he was now. Like he had been dejected, like his cover had been blown. Afterwards, On November 23rd, there was a piece of occipital bone fragment from the lower part of a human skull found. It was known as the Harper fragment. And David Lifton compared the fragment's original X-rays, and it all went the X-rays went contrary to 21 doctors, nurses, and Secret Service agents among specialists who were there, attesting that part of the occipital part of President Kennedy's skull was missing, almost a hole the size of a 3x5 index card. That's how bad, like the black of the skull got blown out, consistent with an exit wound, not an entry wound, by all professional standards. And also, a Dr. Mantic compared the opacity of the skull, and the front transmitted almost 1,000 times as much light as the rear, making the X-rays almost 100% a composite of two X-rays covering up the hole in the rear of the skull. The official X-rays were found to be fraudulent, so tampering with the X-rays. There was a lot of questionable protocol going on with the autopsy. There was witnesses to Oswald being inside of the book depository cafeteria, which is on the first floor, at 12:15, and then buying a Coca-Cola at around 12:30 or 12:31, which was only 1.5 minutes after the first shot was fired. So somehow this guy was almost able to buy a low kick, because he would have had to have fired 3 damn near perfect shots. I believe they said they missed one, but 2 damn near perfect shots from a considerable distance at a moving target, and then run downstairs and go buy a Coke and be witnessed doing this by a police officer and superintendent, and the guy did not seem like he was out of breath, stressed out, nothing. And afterwards, we have another document that came forward I'll speak about in a minute, which basically the time he would have been running down that back stairwell. There was a woman and her friend walking down that stairwell, and they had eyes on the stairwell the entire time, and they did not see Oswald once, which kind of goes against the official word on how he could have been in the cafeteria and on the 6th floor at one time, using a stairwell that was being used by somebody else and not having been seen, especially when he would have had to have ran down those stairs like the Flash in order to get down there quick enough to be able to be spotted by a police officer and superintendent buying a Coke at 12:30 or 12:31. Again, makes absolutely no sense, and it almost looks that he had an alibi. He was witnessed by multiple people in that building to have not been on the 6th floor. There's your alibi right there. Did they bring any of these people to testify? And let's not get into part of one of the documentaries. It was like a bop, 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 bop. That's the way that the bullet sounded. Bop, 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 bop. The guy tapped the table and said it. He said there was a bop, bop. He said there was definitely a bop, bop, like a bop, 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 bop. There's no possibility that there could have been a bop, bop, because the way that a bolt-action rifle works is you have to actually clear the round manually and load another round. So if this was a bolt-action rifle, they would all have been spaced out similarly. And they said there was only 3 shots, so there's clearly some sort of error, or the only way to explain that would be 2 guns being shot at the same time, which is what it looks like there was. An Oswald or a man look-alike was shooting from the 6th floor. Somebody that looked like him was shooting from the 6th floor of a book depository. A bus ticket verified that he had left by bus, and witnesses saw the Rambler head to the Oak Park area where Officer Tippett was killed. And a worker at the theater, which Oswald had ran into afterwards where he was arrested, saw Oswald walk in at 1 to 107, 100%, because he was serving Oswald popcorn at 1:15, which is exactly the time Oswald was supposed to be killing Officer Tippett by location. How the hell was Oswald being served popcorn at 1:15 when he was supposed to be killing a police officer about a mile down the road at 1:15? Doesn't make sense. Not unless it wasn't Oswald that killed the police officer, as witnessed by the first-hand witness, Mrs. Clemens, who stated that a husky Latin man shot the police officer, not Oswald. And a second man was there, and he threw the gun to the second man, who then ran off. Multiple witnesses saw a second man brought outside of the theater. A second man, Oswald, the real Oswald, was brought to the front, and a second man was arrested and brought out the back. People such as a guy who became mayor, Wes Weiss, mechanic T.F. White, a succession stand operator, Butch Burroughs, and hobby shop owner Bert Hare all saw this second Oswald character walking around. Guy that was dressed like Oswald, tall like Oswald, and was just about as much weight as Oswald, just about the same age as Oswald. He had like a double walking around, basically. Somebody even said there was a double in that movie theater. The guy looked just like Oswald. There was a second guy that looked just like him. And this is how they were using this double to make Oswald be in places that he really wasn't. You know, killing a police officer, shooting the president. Air Force Sergeant Robert Vinson saw two men matching this exact description of the husky Latin and the taller guy. He was on a flight to Washington, D.C. to ask for a raise, and somehow he was rediverted, and they stopped at some secret runway in Dallas. He was just wondering who these guys were and why they stopped, why they picked them up. These guys weren't saying anything. You know, it was a very sketchy flight that he went on. He kind of had no idea until he watched the news after, and he goes, "Oh my God, that was the guy that I saw on the plane." And his wife was like, "No, you couldn't have seen that guy. He was already arrested." He's like, "No, he was on a plane." So apparently there was a double. You have multiple witnesses seeing this double of Oswald walking around that area. More than likely somebody that was directly involved in President Kennedy's killing. During the Warren Commission, these doctors were asked very strange questions. Like the doctors that were all stating that the neck wound on the front was an entry wound, that the skull wound was an entry wound, and the back of the skull was an exit wound. All these questions that were trying to be in line with the magic bullet theory were trying to steer the narrative away from the truth. And like the question was, well, I know you said it was an entry wound, but let's say if the bullet had entered through the back and exited through the throat, could it be an exit wound? And the doctor basically said, well, given the set of circumstances you just mentioned, I guess it could be. They were like, oh, our testimony rests. So stating that what we just said, you said it could be an exit wound if it went through the back and exited the throat. Like, yeah, of course, if it went through the back and exited the throat, hypothetically, it could be an exit wound. Like, hypothetically, it could be anything, you know? But the reality was they were saying it was an entry wound from all their expertise. Dr. Hume, he was a naval coroner or a doctor that was doing the autopsy. Goes against normal law. He was at Parkland Memorial Hospital after he got shot. They were going to do the autopsy there, and that is normal law, but they removed them almost like by the military. They removed his body, and they had people in the military do the autopsy, which is almost a way that they used to control the autopsy. There was a Lieutenant Pitzer who had video confirming the kill shot. He retired in 1966, and he had video of the shot and the hole in the back of the head. And people were concerned in the Navy that he was going to run his mouth and maybe go work for a news studio, and maybe he was going to release the video, and they considered that a national security threat. So they found him next to a revolver on the ground with a ladder going up to a ceiling tile. Some people think maybe he was hiding the video up by a ceiling tile, and he was made to get the video, and then he was shot. Lieutenant Marvin said when he was a Green Beret and attending assassination school, he was approached by a man who asked him if he would do a contract for hire, a kill plot to kill Pitzer, and he stated the reason he was given was violating national security to the enemy. And he found out later on that what was meant was national security was him leaking that video to the public. and a CIA agent said, "Wow, things really did go well in Dealey Plaza, didn't they?" Almost making a side comment to how the assassination was a success. It sounds a little cocky and a little, but you never know. You know, people come out and say things that he shouldn't have said. And while towards the end of his life, Kennedy's making friends with Quakers and trying to talk about peace and nuclear disarmament, Truman even spoke out after President Kennedy's assassination, stating that when he originally supported the creation of the CIA, it was not supposed to be a cloak and dagger society. It was supposed to be just for intelligence, and it was taking the wrong way. Pope John Paul XXIII wanted to see the U.S. and Soviet Union together. Another letter showed up November 7th of a man who claimed to be Oswald, threatening to blow up the Dallas police or FBI. Again, sheep dipping. It seemed like it was coming from Oswald, but it didn't really originate from Oswald. And another sheep dipping episode, a man named Ralph Yates, who was a refrigeration mechanic, claimed that he picked up a man with curtain rods, and this guy was Lee Harvey Oswald. And there was this second story about how Oswald brought curtain rods on the following day to the book depository, because that's how he snuck the rifle in there. He said it was curtain rods. So how can he be witness to take curtain rods 2 different times? What do you have, 2 different rifles? Because they only found 1 rifle. It seems like part of the overzealous plan that Yates picked this guy up, and afterwards when he testified that he picked this guy up, and it didn't jive with the fact that somebody else claimed that they were the ones that saw Oswald drop the curtain rods off. They said Yates must have imagined this story, and he was basically ordered to a psychiatric hospital by the FBI because he was hallucinating. And for the rest of his life, he was in to have psychiatric help, being given medication. He died at the age of 39 from heart failure. Kennedy knew something was coming. He would often talk about it with his wife and family, upcoming to the assassination, that people were probably out to get him, and he was hated. He didn't have any qualms about it. He kind of knew what was in the works for him. Journalist Dorothy Kilgallen had a private meeting with Ruby while on trial. She was hounded by FBI agents, then died mysteriously in her bedroom. George Applin, who was an off-duty crane operator, spotted Ruby in the back of the theater when Oswald was arrested. Again, I already had mentioned the similarities between Oswald and Thomas Vallee, how they both serve as intelligence agents and bases in Japan. Both had connections with Cuban exiles, and seemed to have been the Chicago plot was a precursor to what actually played out in Dallas, except it was foiled in Chicago. So this was a very ambitious plan that they kept on taking on. After Oswald was caught, he attempted to call a number, and the number was traced back to 2 people, one of those people being John David Hurt, a U.S. Army counterintelligence agent. Former CIA agent Marchetti stated that, almost without a doubt, the role that John David Hurt played to Lee Harvey Oswald was what they call in the intelligence world a cutout. And a cutout is basically a person that has no links to what you're doing or what your job is or what your mission is, but they're a link for an emergency contact. So like if I was the president of a CIA type of agency or some sort of intelligence agency, and I had a special agent deep undercover, and that agent was to call me directly, any sort of evidence that that agent was associated with me would be very, very, very bad. It could compromise my whole agency. It could compromise the whole situation that I had going on with this agent. So effectively, what I would have them do is I would have them contact somebody who has no connections to me whatsoever, none at all, but somebody who I trust and someone who's in a position where they could be a point of communication. So like I would have you, say if you were the agent that works under me, if ever something ever went all wrong and it was life or death and you needed to get in touch with me, what I'll have you do is I'll have you call your cutout, and then your cutout would take the responsibility, whatever that message is, your cutout would deliver it to me somehow, some way, because your cutout knows how they can get in touch with me already. So effectively you would have this like second party, like a middleman in the message, and the middleman would be your cutout, because ultimately, you know, there'd be no link between the cutout to me or you. He's kind of like the middleman, and that's how we kind of keep this whole thing secret. So they think he was trying to contact this guy because he was in trouble and he wanted to, you know, give some sort of message or get in touch with some sort of, you know, situation that was going on with him. And at that point, I think they had him marked for assassination. He had known too much, and they thought maybe it was just best to get rid of him. Wayne January, the same guy who worked at Redbird Airfield, was speaking with a CIA pilot November 21st, and the pilot basically looked at Wayne and said, "They're going to kill your president, and they're going to kill Robert. They're going to kill any Kennedy that wants to be president. Just know this." And within a day, President Kennedy was shot, and he knew that this pilot said, "Hey, they're going to do this. They're going to kill this guy." Yeah, as a follow-up to reading the book JFK and The Unspeakable, I, you know, just briefly kind of watched a couple documentaries. They talked about the magic bullet and how this bullet wound up at Parkland Memorial Hospital on a stretcher. After all sorts of ballistic testing, this was the bullet CE-399, was the bullet that was responsible for killing Kennedy. Somehow, like during CPR, the bullet was forced back out Kennedy's body. It was perfectly intact. Mind you, this bullet was responsible for not only going through President Kennedy, but also going through Governor Connolly. And if you've ever seen, I've shot a lot of bullets before. If you've ever seen lead, it's kind of a soft metal, comparatively speaking to other types of metals, like steel, for example. Lead would be like almost on the other spectrum of how hard it is. And when you fire a bullet at the speed of, you know, 3,000 or 2,500 to 3,000 feet per second, or let's just say in the mid-2000s, you know, any sort of contact between anything or hard object would bend this bullet left and right, especially if it caused that kind of damage to someone and struck a bone, which they claimed it did, you know, on Connolly's wrist. So it would definitely be bent, and this bullet was pristine. So it looks like this bullet was planted, and they couldn't even keep good pedigree on the bullet. As far as chain of custody, if anybody doesn't know what chain of custody is as a police officer, anytime you take something into evidence, everybody who touches that item from the evidence cabinet or, you know, evidence room has to sign off that they were involved in that chain of custody. So if they say, oh, it was removed from the evidence room for 1 day, so officer so-and-so could check the status of this case or pull a serial number or something, you know, for some needed reason, so it could go to trial at this murder trial, and you have to sign for it. It has to be well documented exactly what happened to this item, who had it, what they did with it. You know, everything has to be pristine, so you could trust that this item that's being held in evidence is the same item that was taken in on day one. And with this CE-399 bullet, they had none of that, and it just seems like it was very suspicious just overall. Going back into Oswald not being at the scene of the 6th floor during the shooting, which was suspicious. Multiple doctors stating that, such as Dr. Perry and Dr. Clark, they were intimidated to say that the neck wound was an exit wound. Seibert, there was an exit wound in the back of the head. This was an FBI agent, Secret Service agent. Sprague received a letter from Dr. Berkeley and said others must have participated in the assassination. And one of the members of the Warren Commission, Ford, hired the bullet to match the neck in order so that it would fit the premise of the Warren Commission. And according to a man named Otepka, Oswald was listed as the CIA employee before the assassinations. October 8th, like I already stated, Oswald was removed from Flash. Kennedy supported support for President de Gaulle as CIA supported a coup against him. And we spoke about Operation Northwoods already. And right after Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ modified National Security Action Memorandum 273 to where certain passage of this 273 stating that U.S. military would only be used as support for an invasion or any war in Vietnam, to effectively taking that out altogether and having no guidelines or limits to what the United States, or what facility or what capacity the United States military would play at Vietnam, basically leaving an open door policy for what eventually happened, for them to send damn near 200,000 people over there in order to fight a war. World War II veterans were behind the President Kennedy's limousine, and they were friends with Kennedy, and they basically stated that they've been at war before, and they know that they were in a place of crossfire. They could hear the bullets coming in from different angles. So it just leads to, again, multiple shooters, multiple people involved. The names, some of the names are the same, but the same concept of what happened out there. Strong cover-up, strong evidence of breaches of security within the Secret Service. Oh, and another strong thing was that they said that the Warren Commission was blaming Kennedy for ramping down the security. Meanwhile, it wasn't Kennedy at all. They said he was pretty easygoing. They said it was the Secret Service that ramped down the security, why they didn't have motorcycles on the side of the president limousine, why they didn't have people riding on the back of the limousine like they normally would have. It was all internal, that this level of security was pulled, allowing him to be out there like a sitting duck. Okay, so now I'm trying to just to wrap this up, because I've spent so much time on this, damn near 2 hours and 40 minutes. I mean, there's just so much information, and I've only covered, a little bit of the information. I mean, there's just so much. I just highlighted key points of all this investigation that I've done. It just goes on and on and on. So the fact that there is so much more to be covered, and I just don't have the time to do it all. I can't, like I said, I've said with other podcasts, I've already kind of maxed my limit out at 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is a longer podcast that most people will do on a subject, because there's just so many facts and so many figures. And this is why the average person doesn't get involved with this type of research, because they're just too busy living life to get bogged down in this sort of thing, to where they're having to split hairs and look through reports and trying to compare this and that and how this makes sense and how it doesn't. It's really, the thought line is like, how's this involve me? Why do I care? A lot of people don't, and they should, because this is very important information about, effectively what we're talking about is a military coup here that occurred in the United States, and it was passed off as the work of a lone gunman. And the evidence is overwhelming the more you start looking into it. So just to kind of bring this all back to maybe some other things going on in the world, as far as, this whole push for this whole UFO disclosure movement, it's very similar. The fact that they're withholding all these documents still of the Kennedy assassination, and it's not much different about what they're doing, about how they tried to sham with Project Blue Book with the UFO investigation, how they dumbed the numbers down. The unknowns were 22, then they dumbed them down to 6, then they dumbed them down to 3%. And they said, well, if we had better information, we'd probably be able to explain this 3% of unknowns. Then the Robertson panel, 1953. So the Blue Book was 52 to 69. Robertson panel was 1953. There's this whole UAP, UFO thing. Back then it was just UFO, no threat to national security. Apparently that's all flipped around, because we had in 2009, 2010, we had ATIP, Advanced Threat Identification Program, Aerial Advanced Threat Identification Program, and then we had the Condon Committee trying to close Project Blue Book to the public, saying nothing to see here, folks. 1968, nothing has come from 20 years of investigation of this subject. It's a good way to justify closing Project Blue Book, with this sort of conclusion in the Condon Committee. 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, stated the records have to be 25 years older and can't compromise national security, only applies to non-tech records. So, they modified this 2023 UAP disclosure by Senator Rounds and Senator Schumer, by the Senate Armed Service Committee, stating that any entity in possession of related UFO or biologics would have to disclose. So there's a lot of talk in the world of UFO disclosure that there was elements within the government, for example, that are being supported by the large funders of some of these constituents, of like Lockheed Martin, Radiance Technologies, represented by Michael Turner, who is a representative for the geographical area where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is located. If anybody knows any UFO lore, that is where apparently a lot of the wreckage and a lot of the biologics from the Roswell incident was brought to. And it's been known that there's been underground tunnels and bases out there, which originally were used to store photography in World War One and into World War Two, and then they realized it would be a good place to store these biologics because they're already secure, they're already underground, they're on an Air Force base. It kind of became the perfect place for these secrets to be held. There was like a blue room, I forget. There was a blue room down there, and there's a famous story about somebody calling one of these generals, and he basically asked him about the blue room, and the guy told him never to bring this subject up again. He cursed him out on the phone. So a lot of people who were the who's who of the people that were in the know knew about these situations. And then the reason why I'm kind of trying to drag all this back to Kennedy and kind of just compare a little bit of it, because these companies currently are being brought out. The top donors, which are Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, General Dynamics, to Michael Turner. These are the reasons why the 2023 UAP Disclosure Act, which seems so optimistic, now has turned into more of just like a record dump of older records, and it's been basically like stymied due to a defense budget, due to defense contractors who got their hands in the pockets of these people who are representing us, so they can make weapons, so they can make technology, so they could shop it and make big boatloads of money and sell it to the defense industry. Meanwhile, the reality of all these things going on and right in front of the eyes of the public are being pulled back, and they're stating, oh, well, nothing to see here because this is a national security matter. You don't need to, you don't need to be getting involved with this. Meanwhile, this completely robs the general public of their right and their desire and their need to know, because of the life-saving technologies that these sorts of projects would offer to the public. That it's their tax dollars that are paying for it, so they should know. But apparently, money being this whole, if there was anything to be learned on these advanced civilizations, they're trying to just shop it into the world of the military and, weaponize it and then make boatloads of money off it. So a few people profit off of the masses, which is a problem to many, many people. And, it looks like it's being done directly in front of the public eye. Like we were so optimistic, 2023 UAP Disclosure Act, biologics, the whole nine. Now all of a sudden, no. Lockheed Martin, all these guys that have been making money hand over fist for years with this stuff, wants to pull this back into the world of secrecy and lies and threats. And that's being done right in front of the public eye, And I guess more to be had on this at a later time. Some of these committees that are pushing for the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. The House Oversight Committee, which is Republican, and the chairman is James Comer. And the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is Democratic, represented by Mark Warner and Marco Rubio. So hopefully we have less, we could see how the documents relating to Kennedy via what Trump said in 2017, how they're damaging to national security. And people question, how could that be? How could that be all these years later? And I'm just saying that all these years later, there's a lot. It's almost like a skeleton in the closet of the United States. And it points the finger at intelligence agencies and inner workings of corruption and, war. And it's a lot of ugly stuff. So I don't know who's going to fry for that now, who's going to be responsible for that all these years later, and how much has actually changed. So it makes us scratch our heads. who's really calling the shots here. When you can have a president of the most powerful country on the planet be gunned down right in front of the American public, then have it swept under the carpet and brushed into a little simple story, minimizing the actual gravity of this situation and how much this has affected so many people, and the war that Kennedy was trying to stop with Vietnam, and the war that was fought, and the hundreds of thousands of people that were killed or injured and horribly affected by these wars, and and how the people that were behind this, and it was a failed war, just got away with it. It's a travesty. It's like the worst type of travesty. I'm out there working as a police officer. I blink my eyes the wrong way, say something the wrong way, or make a split-second bad decision in a life or death situation, and I'll be basically pinned up and judged by every person in this country as being a bad person. And it's the spotlight that somebody like me is under, making basically chump change to what some of these defense contractors have made in times of war and such. It's criminal to the 10th power, that we hold the people that are more in the public eye and that are lower on the totem pole into these high standards, yet people that are really far up there making boatloads of money, getting involved in wars and doing things they shouldn't be doing, and could result in a war that winds up claiming the lives of a couple 100,000 people, and nobody steps forward afterwards to take any responsibility for it. Just like, oh well, that's just the cost of doing business and keeping people free. And then as long as they frame it under that framework, they can get away with it. So, but I'm optimistic. Hopefully, some sort of breakthrough, some sort of brave whistleblower comes forward. Until then, I can keep talking about it. And it was interesting going into all this information and learning all this about President Kennedy and what type of person he was, and his push to make the world a safer place for our children and for everybody and for all life on this planet, to stop nuclear war, and a push towards peace and cooler heads prevailing. And unfortunately, because he was that person and he stood staunchly and firmly in the face of some really bad people and some really evil people, there was no choice on their angle, because they were so threatened by him that they had to have him removed from power. And hopefully, some people who've heard this narrative and, some of the facts about this extraordinary story and the things that have been withheld for all these years, they can come to a better conclusion on what exactly happened out there and why it happened in Dallas on that afternoon of December 22nd, 1963. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this episode of Not Media. Please like and subscribe on YouTube and all major formats for podcasting, Spotify, iTunes, and stand by for episode 13, when I interview Frank Morano. It was a great interview, and I hope everybody tunes in to listen, like, and subscribe. Send this to all your friends and let them know if you liked what you heard, and I will keep looking into the unknown and trying to make some headway on, bringing some information that needs to be known to the public, putting it out there so we all could grow and we all could be better people for it, and the world could be a better place for it also. All right, thank you. I appreciate everybody listening. Everybody stay well. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying until next time. This is your host, at Not Media, JP, signing off. Stay well, everyone.